Hello, student. I am Professor Smitaja from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm here to discuss the very relevance of novel writing and also the entertainment recreation part during the Victorian era. Just like us, Victorians also had their own means of entertainment. One striking characteristic of the Victorian forms of recreation is that they were, for the most part, active. The age of passive entertainment, of watching television or listening to the radio, had not yet arrived. In short, one had to make one's own fun. For starters, entertainment was often a shared activity rather than a solitary one. Social entertainment, such as outdoor sports or indoor games, were plentiful. In the earlier part of the Victorian period, women's pastimes were often limited to indoor activities. Victorian magazines offer a host of arts and crafts features, and it seems that the Victorian woman was probably expected to stay quietly at home with her needlework while the males of the household went out and played cricket or hunted. This began to change in the late 1880s. A major source of entertainment, the theatre halls were numerous and performances were regularly given by theatre troupes. Ventriloquists, hypnotists, poets, comedians, choir, and orchestras. Circuses came to town and set up in parks and public places. There were feasts, carnivals, art exhibitions, and lessons in singing, dancing, cooking to attend. Talks were given by visiting notables, scientists, preachers, and people who had been adventuring in different countries. Depending on your social status, you could join various social groups such as the gleaners of nature, sewing and craft groups, sporting and church groups, as well as various lodges and friendly societies. Well to do ladies often join committees and organize events such as bazaars, fetes, and exhibitions to raise money for hospitals, churches, and charitable exhibitions. A popular means of entertainment, literature of the Victorian era differed from that of 18th century and Romantic period, most significantly because it was not aimed at a specialist or elite audience. Rather, because the steam printing press made the production of text much cheaper and because railroads could distribute text quickly and easily, the Victorian period was a time when new genres appealed to newly mass audiences. Before the Victorian era, poetry had been the dominant form of literature. However, changes in class structure saw the novel rise in popularity. The novel's popularity exploded as the middle class expanded and more people became literate. These works also became more accessible due to the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of newspaper and the periodical press. Most notably, the works of Charles Dickens were frequently serialized in newspapers or journals. As a result of this serialization and a focus on character rather than plot, Dickens' work are sometimes criticized for having weak plots. The subject matter of Victorian novels also helped increase their popularity. These novels would often portray the lives of working class people, creating character that the newly rising middle class audience could relate to. The realistic novel was quite different than what has been seen in earlier literature. This form of literature used journalistic techniques to make the literature something closer to real life with facts and general stereotypes of human nature. The attention to detail was made to just report the facts, not commenting or judging on the scene or character. The plot usually included a lower class citizen trying to gain upward mobility. Thus, a subgenre called social realism was born. One of the most popular novels of this time is in social realism genre. In Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, the novel goes through a boy named Pip's life as he unexpectedly comes into money and is asked to become a gentleman. The novel follows Pip's struggles and focuses on telling the whole truth about the character. Queen Victoria's reign lasted until 1901, and the literature that was being produced closer to the turn of the century shared few characteristics with the earlier works of Victorian era. The novelist at the turn of the century continued to explore the problems in English life, but explored other key themes as well. The greatest departure from the early Victorian era came from those authors' exploration of themes such as sexuality and the impact of science and technology. The characteristic feature of realistic Victorian novels include an emphasis on the here and now, attention to a specific action and verifiable consequences, description of common action, surface details, and minor catastrophes of the middle class, use of simple direct language, and a spatial focus on characterization along with the abundance of characters and social type. So, what is realism? Quite obviously, the genre of realism is dedicated to identifying what is real and what is not. But what exactly is real? That is the question. Real literature in realism defines reality as something that exists prior to and completely separate from human thought or speech. Therefore, the realists believe that it is literature's responsibility to accurately interpret and represent reality. As literature attempts to do this, it simultaneously depicts the anxieties, desires, and achievements of the Victorian period. While realism certainly encompasses its own unique ideas, the genre continued to utilize the strength of empiricism and romanticism. For example, the topic of nature is still focused upon, but realistic literature acknowledges the fact that the human mind is a separate entity from nature. Therefore, realistic literature aims to answer the question of how the mind can possibly know and understand nature accurately. Realism began as a literary movement in response to and as a departure from the idealism of the Romantic period. Realism emerged in literature in the second half of the 19th century. For realists, the plot was no longer the central focus. Instead of that, creating interesting and complex characters took precedence. Realism also emphasized describing the material and physical details of life, as opposed to the natural world as characterized by the Romantic period. Many realistic novelists veered away from the softer aspects of Romanticism, such as intense tenderness and idealism. The cause behind this departure was their belief that those characteristics misrepresented the harsh realities of life. Realism emphasizes accurate descriptions of setting, dress, and character in ways that would have appeared inappropriate to earlier authors. Realism, which stresses upon the importance of ordinary person and the ordinary situation, generally rejects the heroic and the aristocratic. Now, there are criticisms of realism. Let us know what are those. The realistic novel was very bold compared to the literature of the previous ages. The realistic novel was meant to be lifelike, so the literature would hold things in it that were taboo before. It also showed a lot of unfortunate events. Critics complained that authors only focused on the negatives. It was also noted that the attention to details of the character led to little plot development. So it is important to know representational versus revelation theories and the importance of the word idea in such representational theories. So, representational theories are specifically concerned with what separates the mind from the world surrounding it. Revelation theories, on the other hand, are more interested in the immediate knowledge of what is considered real, invoking either perception or intuition to achieve that knowledge. Moreover, in this light, it is equally important to acknowledge the word idea. How exactly does one define the word? In Victorian realism, idea can be interpreted in two equally meaningful ways: perceptual or linguistic representation. From these concepts, one can see the very direct influence of Lockean principles, which affirm that words function as representative. To genuinely understand Victorian realism, it is almost necessary to first acknowledge that nothing is real. Following that, understanding is the comprehension of the paramount concept of representation. Nothing is real until the human mind perceives it and assigns it valuable meaning. Sometimes Victorian realists admitted to being quite overwhelmed by the idea of a gap existing between the human mind and the rest of the world or reality. One such realist, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, an English poet and artist, acknowledged how frightening this doctrine was. But at the same time, he expressed attraction to it as well. It seemed that he found these representational theories to be endlessly fascinating, as he came to realize that his artistic products might be entirely divorced from reality and the world around him. Perhaps it can comfort an artist if he can produce something beautiful through his subjective interpretation of reality. It can be an easy feat to create such art and subsequently allow others and even oneself to search for significance and meaning under the physical surface. As an author of this era, George Eliot used literature not simply just to entertain, but also to inform people of the conditions of people in the society around her. Growing up in a hectic and interesting environment herself, Mary N. Evans, whose pen name was George Eliot, used her stories to study how environments, especially social environments, affect people and their character. Eliot, who was a fan of art and its origins, believed that any work of art should be based on life rather than other works of art. For instance, The Mill on the Floss was based on Eliot's real life experience of being rejected by her friends and family for her common law marriage. Although she was also an influential author of the Victorian era, she criticized authors like Dickens and Austen on their style of writing. Charles Dickens directed his attention more towards revelation theories than the representational. On the topic of reality being understood as what is immediately available to one's senses, Dickens further highlighted the importance of memory, which he described as a kind of vision or way of seeing the world. Moreover, in his narrative style novel, Great Expectations, memory is a key concept in the story as Pip recalls all of the events from memory. Some readers complain about the fact that the novel doesn't offer anyone's perspective other than Pip's, but Dickens likely chose to do this on purpose. He viewed memory and revelation theories as very important to realistic literature, and a narrative could be described as a kind of written memory. To write the novel from such a perspective begs an important and highly relevant question from the readers. How do we know that Pip's descriptions and thoughts are accurate representations of reality? The honest answer is that we simply do not. And this kind of ambiguity leads to very interesting discussions about Victorian realism. Narratives were extremely popular among Victorian realists. Along with challenging the notion of what is real and what is not, comes the impression of suspense experienced by the readers. By suspense, the obvious interpretation of the word means that the reader experiences tension and anxiety throughout the story. But this tension is an attractive one that motivates him to read further. At the same time, suspense also refers to the action of actually suspending judgment as both a Victorian reader and a writer. But what is meant by judgment? Of course, it is only human nature to judge a piece of literature as one reads it. But in the topic of Victorian realism, the judgment that should be suspended refers to the judgment of what the speaker in a narrative is portraying as real. Moreover, the reader is expected to take what the narrator says at face value. Additionally, judgment must also be suspended as a reader makes assumptions based upon his unique beliefs. Doing so brings us back to the earlier definition of suspense, in which the reader is meant to feel anxious about the rising action in a narrative. If a reader refuses to suspend his judgment in his assumptions, beliefs, and subjective interpretations of reality, he will not experience the pleasure of suspense. For example, in Dickens' Great Expectation, a great deal of suspense arises from the fact that Pip does not know, for the majority of the novel, who his benefactor is. The pleasure of reading the novel comes from readers' guesswork about the identity of the benefactor. In general, when a secret emerges in Victorian fiction and the suspense is lifted, things often turn out to be entirely different than what was expected. Realism had turned to naturalism towards the end of the 19th century. With naturalism, writers defined their character using their heredity and history, qualities that people found distasteful in realism, which was the fixation with character, and the thoroughly dull plots was intensified by naturalism. The impact was uniquely because of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution that inspired other writers to branch out into something that differs from realism. Whereas realism seeks only to describe subjects as they really are. Naturalism also endeavors to govern scientifically the underlying forces like the heredity and history, manipulating all of the actions of the subject. So, we should know the popularity of the realistic Victorian novel. The most popular novel of the Victorian age were realistic, thickly plotted, crowded with characters, and long. They described contemporary life and provided entertainment for the middle class. According to Merriam Webster, popularity is the stage of being liked, enjoyed, accepted, or done by a large number of people. So, the popularity of the realistic Victorian novels was entirely dependent on the people who read them. So, what are the subtypes of realism as seen in the Victorian novels? So, first it is satirical realism. William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair exemplifies satirical realism that emphasizes the worst qualities of each character and suggests that the world is a dark and unfair place. The novel follows the adventures of Becky Sharp, a scheming and amoral heroine who does very well for herself, and contrasts her with Amelia Sedley, a trusting and virtuous young woman who struggles to find happiness. The second is psychological realism. Psychological realism emphasizes portraying the rich inner life of characters, their thoughts, feelings, motivations, anxieties, etc. In George Eliot's Middlemarch, for instance, he portrays the progress of several marriages in a small provincial town. Dorothea Brooke, the heroine, is an idealist who marries an elderly scholar Casaubon, but she becomes disillusioned and finds herself attracted to his nephew, Will Ladislaw. The third is social realism. So it focuses on the foibles, eccentricities, and remarkable characteristics of people who are frequently caricatured, often comic and sometimes tragicomic. It is best exemplified by the work of Charles Dickens. It novels like Oliver Twist, in which Dickens uses the plight of the orphan Oliver to critique a heartless orphanage overseen by eccentric bumblers. Dickens both criticized the social system and created a vibrant world of memorable characters. The rapid transformation of Britain into an industrial society also prompted some writers to write novels that exposed the difficult plight of the working class. In Dickens' Hard Times, the mill worker hero Stephen Blackpool faces ostracism after he refuses to join the mill workers union. Similarly, Elizabeth Gaskell, North and South, uses the viewpoint of Margaret Hale, an emigrant from southern England to a northern industrial city, to address the plight of mill workers. As Dickens and Gaskell focused on important domestic issues, other writers turned their attention to Britain's rapidly expanding empire. Rudyard Kipling celebrated the British rule in India with his novel Kim. Joseph Conrad took a more skeptical stance towards imperialism in The Heart of Darkness, in which the sailor Marlowe journeys through the Belgian Congo. Although different kinds of realism dominated the novel in the Victorian period, the 18th century tradition of the Gothic lived on, particularly in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. This novel used many Gothic conventions: a young, pure female heroine, a sinister house filled with mysteries, and a handsome, brooding older man. But within a Victorian frame, Jane Eyre must make her own way in the world as a governess, and must also pursue what is right for her despite Victorian gender and class conventions. Jane Eyre uses some Gothic tropes, but sensation fiction, so named because its suspenseful plot inspired dangerous sensations in readers, more fully embrace the surprise and horror typical of the Gothic. Sensation fiction typically centers on deception and bigamy, in which men or women are lured into fake marriages. Wilkie Collins' The Women in White, which tells the story of two women who look strangely alike and are substituted for each other at various points, is perhaps the most famous example. Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, in which a supposedly deranged woman tries to kill her husband, also shocked Victorian readers. The serial form of publishing, in which installments of novel were released at regular intervals, encouraged engaged audiences. Victorian books are also famously long. The rise of lending libraries, which would individually lend out volumes of a book, also contributed to the great length of Victorian novels. A three-volume book could be read by three readers at the same time, while a one-volume book could only be read by one. Lending libraries made more money on triple deckers. Newspaper also played a major role in the realistic novel's popularity. Simultaneously, the number of periodicals being produced greatly increased during that time. By the early 19th century, there were 52 London papers and over 100 other titles. There was a massive growth in the overall circulation of major events, information, and weekly publication of literature. The development of the press was greatly assisted by the gradual abolition of the taxes on periodicals. With the cheaper price of printing, British journalism and periodical writing flourished and formed a significant part of Victorian literary production. Essayists like John Ruskin, Thomas Carlyle, Thomas Babington, Macaulay, John Stuart Mill, and Matthew Arnold all wrote famous works of non-fiction prose that analyzed British history and critiqued current trends in British society. Professional female journalists like Harriet Martineau and prominent reformers like Florence Nightingale also used the periodical press to raise awareness about important issues in British society. Finally, important figures in British literature were also frequent contributors to the periodical press. Dickens ran a literary magazine called Household Words, while Eliot edited the Westminster Review for several years. The 19th century is also seen as the golden age of children literature. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass narrate the story of Alice, who finds herself in a place called Wonderland, populated by grinning cats, mad hatters, and an evil queen. J.M. Barrier's Peter and Wendy similarly imagines a fantastical place of mermaid lagoons, evil pirates, and fairy magic. The last part of Victorian period is referred to as the Findassical. Novels from this period tend to be more melancholy and bleak. Thomas Hardy's famously depressing novels Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Judy the Obscure, for instance, describe how their protagonists' lives are ruined by social forces. Tess gives birth to a child out of wedlock, which causes the husband she later marries to shun her when he finds out. Jude Foley's dreams of becoming a student at an elite university are destroyed both by his low social status as a stone worker and by a disastrous early marriage. Findaysical literature is also characterized by a move away from the forms of realism that had dominated the earlier part of the century and into genre fiction. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's famous detective Sherlock Holmes made his first appearance in 1886. Science fiction also became popular in the Findaisical as H.G. Wells imagined future worlds in the Time Machine and an alien invasion in the War of the Worlds. Oscar Wilde wrote hilarious, witty plays like The Importance of Being Earnest, which describes the comic endeavors of two men who are trying to marry two women, both of whom are determined to marry men named Ernest. Although Wilde was the toast of the literary town at the time of the play's production, he was soon prosecuted for sodomy and thrown into jail. His Ballad of Reading Gaol is a mournful evocation of prison life and the death of dreams. So, rise of feminism and important female novelist is needed to know because this aspect was very important during Victorian era. So this was a period of great social and political reform, especially regarding the role of women. Women began actively seeking equal social and legal rights as men, and one of the main ways they attempted to draw attention to their plight was through writing. Women wrote in order to make a living, contribute to the literary world, and most importantly, change British society and fight for women's right. Voting and property rights, education opportunities, and employment restrictions were all issues which the women of 19th century Britain faced. Many women started publishing their work to make their voices heard. As a result, feminism started to gain momentum. Out of frustration, women faced with the openly unfair and worsening social and political situation. Some of the more popular female novelists of this time include Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot. Many women of the Victorian era published their work anonymously or under pseudonyms to ensure that their works would be given the same merit as the works of male authors. Using gender ambiguous pseudonyms allowed female novelists the freedom to create characters exactly the way they wished. The idea of the new woman was also popular during the Victorian era and served as a significant cultural icon. The new woman was the opposite of the stereotypical Victorian woman who was uneducated, reliant entirely on a man, and led on entirely domestic life. Instead, the new woman was intelligent, independent, educated, and self supporting. This ideology played a significant role in important social changes that would lead to redefining gender roles. Charlotte Bronte was one of the most prominent realistic Victorian novelists and published most of her work under the general neutral pseudonyms Currer Bell. In her novels, Bronte created a strong female heroines who possessed free thought, intellect, and a strong moral character. She wrote for the women she saw as being oppressed by society, which included teachers, governesses, and spinster. She felt that all of these women were imprisoned by society or circumstances beyond their control, and Bronte was impelled to speak out for them in her writing. Unmarried, middle class women either had to turn to prostitution or be a governess in order to earn a living. However, a governess had no security of employment, received minimal wages, and was isolated in the household with the level of being somewhere in between a family members and a servant. A large number of middle class women in Victorian England had to serve in ambiguous role of governess. And this led to a rise in popularity of the governess novel. The most popular example of a governess novel would be Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, which is a fictional autobiography of the orphan Jane Eyre as she matures and becomes a governess at Thornfield Manor. Thus, Victorian novels served as both entertainment and social commentary, captivating readers with their intricate narratives while simultaneously engaging them in social issues. The serialized format of these novels allowed for a communal reading experience, fostering discussions about social justice and morality among diverse audiences. Ultimately, the enduring popularity of these novels lies in their reflection on the human condition amidst the complexities of rapidly changing world. With this, I wrap up the discussion today. Let us meet in another lecture with another topic. Thank you.